All right, welcome to the August educational webinar, Healthy Food, Healthy Humans. And today I have three wonderfully healthy and delightful humans to tell us about how they grow healthy food and other features today. So let's jump on in. So today I will introduce our workflow. We'll have some rules of engagement, introduce our folks, we'll have a discussion, and my goal for this discussion is that we actually get to discuss back and forth and have a dynamic conversation. So I don't even know where it's going to go. It's going to be excellent. And then from there, we'll integrate some of your questions and have a wonderful time together. So a few instructions. If you are just joining in, there is a lot going on your screen right now, which I'm going to show you here. I'm going to bounce back and forth. So to be able to access this, which if you're hearing my voice right now, you've already clicked play on this box. And if you would like to input a question for us to integrate into the panel, please enter that into the green box right here. That is what I will receive and try to incorporate into our discussion. There's also a chat box here in blue where you can ask questions of one another, introduce yourselves, and build a bigger network of folks who are thinking about healthy plants, healthy humans, and a healthy planet. Did I cover everything here? Yes. Okay, here we go. So today, we get to hear from Dr. Elaine Ingham, a soil microbiologist and an incredible woman. Didi Pershouse, the soil sponge strategist, also another incredible woman. Dan Kittredge, the founder and executive director of the Bionutrient Food Association, also a wonderful human. And myself, I am here. My name is Dr. Adrienne Gottschalks. I am a researcher and mentor for the Soil Food Web School. Let's jump on in. So my first question to our panelists is, would you please briefly introduce yourselves and how your work relates to healthy humans, healthy food? Didi, take it away.
Well, hi, everybody. I'm glad to have you with us. I started off actually as a holistic healthcare provider for about 25 years and got really intrigued as I was writing a book called The Ecology of Care. Got really intrigued at how the health of a landscape, particularly something that I call the soil sponge, impacts human health, public health, all the way from flooding and drought and wildfire prevention to the nutrient density of food, to air quality and water quality, etc. And so I actually shifted my career to start writing, teaching, creating curriculum, and now stewarding a long-term community of people interested in looking at these issues. So I do that mostly through the Land and Leadership Initiative and teach internationally and have fun with it. It's been both careers have been fun. So.
Wonderful. Thank you. Awesome. And Dan, would you care to introduce yourself and how your work relates to healthy food, healthy humans?
Yeah. I'm, as you said before, the founder and executive director of the Bionutrient Food Association. That's a 10-year-old educational organization focused on increasing quality in the food supply, by which we mean flavor, aroma, nutritive value, which we think connects to soil health, plant health, and human health. My background is I grew up on an organic farm. I've been living in that culture basically my entire life. My work pertains to healthy humans. Specifically, we've been working for the past 5 years on a project to build instruments that can be used by anyone to assess relative nutrient density in real time. So flash a light at a carrot, get a reading, flash a light at a piece of beef, get a reading. And we've built the instruments, a first generation of instruments to do that. A second step of that project is to identify the variation in nutrient levels that exists in food, which hasn't been done yet globally by anyone, it seems. And we've made some serious progress on that and identified quite profound variations. And then the third step of that project is to correlate the environmental conditions, the management practices, et cetera, to the nutrient variation. And so we've done a lot of work there as well. And so, what we found is variation's massive. It correlates very nicely with management practices. The things that are broadly understood to be regenerative practices correlate very nicely with increased soil carbon, increased soil biological activity, increased nutrient levels in food. And so it's a broad endeavor. It'll take a little while to get it accomplished. But we're trying to bring some transparency to that whole process and say, look, if people can choose the food for their families based on its nutritional value, that'll not only be good for them, but because we understand the only way to grow food well is in deep symbiosis with life, with nature, with microbes, then the act of choosing food that's good for your family will be a powerful way to drive healing of the earth.
Wonderful. I love that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And Dr. Elaine, will you tell us, please, about yourself and how your work relates to healthy humans and healthy plants, healthy planet, all the health?
Well, yeah. The simplest way to think about this is we can't be healthy if we aren't consuming foods from a healthy soil that has all the different sets of microorganisms present in that soil to allow the plant to be able to express its genetic potential of making certain that it's got the right nutrients in its body to feed us, of course, right? Well, is which comes first? It's one, you have to have both. So understanding that soil and what the organisms are that are needed. Most people, they always are coming up to me and asking, what's the sets of organisms I need? What are the amounts for to have a healthy plant? And I always have to respond by saying, well, standard ecological answer, it depends. What is it that you're growing? In what conditions are you growing? We have to make certain that the microorganisms in that soil will operate under the conditions, the climate, the bioregion that they're in. And so there isn't one food web structure that's going to work for all plants. It's not a one size fits all kind of situation. And so we're very interested in understanding how to manage that biology in the soil. What should you have in that soil before you put your crop out? Make certain that you've got all the right organisms in all the proper balances. When we start to understand all of the things, the benefits that a healthy soil food web has for your plant, there are 7 overarching principles that we like to teach people and make certain that they're keeping an eye on all of these processes that the microorganisms do. So if you want to have a healthy plant, you better have a root system. You better have the biology around that root system that's going to be able to make the enzymes to pull the nutrients into the bacteria and fungi. Bacteria and fungi are happily reproducing, multiplying. It attracts those organisms, the bacteria and fungi, attract the predators into that root system. And when the bacteria and fungi are eaten by protozoa, nematodes, microarthropods, earthworms, incatriodes, all the different types of predators in the system, that's going to release the nutrients that the plant requires in the proper balances for the plant to be able to take up those nutrients. Now, the plant might not take up all of those solubilized nutrients. So how do you prevent those nutrients from being lost? The next time it rains, the next time you irrigate, those soluble nutrients are going to be washed out of your soil unless you've got the bacteria and fungi still growing. So you always have to have more bacteria and fungi than you have predators, so that whatever isn't taken up by your plant is now held right around the root system of that plant. If the plant is getting all the nutrients it needs, there is almost no way that disease-causing organisms are going to be successful in colonizing your plant, coming in and taking over and causing disease or reduction in yield So we've got to have those preventative organisms building the castle wall, the knights in white shining armor, protecting your root system from all the bad guys that could be out there. We want to make certain that we're growing the crop that you want. And therefore the balance of fungi to bacteria is critical, because you don't want weeds growing. You don't want plants that aren't going to serve a function in that system. But bare soil is bad news. Anytime it starts raining or you irrigate, those drops of water are going to smack onto the surface of your soil and start compacting your soil. So how do you prevent that? We've got to have understory sets of plants that work with your crop plant to maintain the growth of your crop plant and prevent compaction. So how do you reduce that compaction forming every year? So see, you don't have to till. So lots of other things I could talk about right here, but I hope I've given you an inkling of why that biology in the soil is so very important to making certain that the nutrients are going to get into the plant, and those nutrients are going to get into the animals, the human beings included, so that we can be healthy.
Thank you. That was a beautiful primer on the soil food web and conferring benefits. I also love this image, I want to point out, because you just look so happy handing over that soil sample. It's like, here are some healthy microbes, take them and go forth.
Here, you look through the microscope.
Which is a beautiful gift that you've given all of us by creating the Soil Food Web School. So thank you. And the next thing that I want to do is actually stop sharing the screen. But before I do, my question to each of you is, what do you want to learn from one another? And I've been a part of several panels and live events like this, but one of the most interesting things that I find is that each of you has a career path of breaking out of just focusing on the soil and expanding your view to see how does this affect each other and our society and ourselves. And each of you has broken the mold just a little bit to create something new and a new way of thinking about it. And so I want to offer this up as a space for you to learn from one another and have the discussion that you want to be doing on your Wednesday mid-morning. So take it away. Who's curious? Who has a question?
So for Dan, I would like to ask you the question of, you've got this wonderful instrument that you can basically flash light at the surface of that plant, and back comes an answer about how much nutrient is actually present. A kind of couple of questions here, actually. Is that total nutrient of that kind? Or do you have to go exploring, like, say, with nitrogen? Do you have a way to figure out nitrate present versus ammonium present, say, in the plant or in the soil? What I'm most interested in is, can I use this in soil to get this information so much more rapidly than sending samples off to a chemistry lab? And can you see differences from day to day? If I go out every morning at 8 o'clock and flash my light, would I be able to see that change in the forms of those nutrients or the total nutrients? Is it that easy to get this information?
Okay, I'll try to answer that one. So a couple of things. For starters, we have been focusing on the part of the plant that you eat as the thing we calibrate the instrument to. And so
not soil yet, hey?
Well, it is calibrated for carbon. So it's actually pretty good at telling you carbon levels. Actually very good at giving you carbon levels. But it does not tell you biological activity, does not tell you microbiome. I mean, those are, so, I'll just stand back for a second and talk about the spectrometer and the concept of the spectrometer. In principle, everything in chemistry is a vibration in physics. So copper vibrates and protein vibrates. And so that vibration is a kind of light. And so if you can take the right kind of picture of that light, you can see what's in something. And that's how we know what's in the stars, is not from going there, but from taking pictures of that light. So spectroscopy is the field of science that does that. So people may have, I recollect from Star Trek, there was a tricorder, which was a thing that you just sort of went zoop, and you could see what something was. So, you know, 13 years ago, before smartphones came out, you know, the concept of a smartphone might have seemed, of what they are now, might have seemed profoundly like earth shattering. Like, what are the implications? I can't even comprehend it. How is it going to affect culture, et cetera? But the first smartphones were not particularly sophisticated. I mean, at least in relation to where we are now. I would say, you know, what we're doing is we're building, you know, consumer spectrometers, which will have some profound effect on culture. But where we're at right now with the first generation is that it's not very sophisticated. So I use the metaphor in this case of Apple, and, you know, we have iPhones now. Some people have MacBooks. You know, prior to that, we had desktop Apple computers. There was originally this thing called an Apple II, which is, I think, the first one they came out with. It was available, and it was pretty rudimentary. If you were a coder, you could use it, but if you were, you know, I mean, there wasn't a lot. It wasn't great. So I want to say that the one we have right now is like the Apple II. It's not great. It's rudimentary. It's a first generation. Certainly, the intention is, and, you know, I think in the relatively near future, we will have this ability to do exactly what you're talking about, Elaine, which is to assess soil and get meaningful readings from that soil, to assess plants as they're growing and get meaningful readings from those plants as they're growing. We've recently set up a new engineering lab here in Massachusetts to sort of take that Apple II to bring it to an iPhone. So is it 2 years out? Is it 3 years out? You know, is it 5 years out? I think it's probably more like the 2 or 3 year range until we have those really sophisticated scientific instruments that can be used for this purpose in real time. And so, and they're probably going to be more than $350, which is what the meter we have right now is. At least the first generations of them will be. So our idea is that we have this instrumentation that can be used across the supply chain. It's not just for the consumer to say, do I want to buy this bag of carrots or that bag of carrots, or is this beef any good for me or not? But it can be used by the grower, can be used by agronomists, can be used by buyers and wholesalers and processors and retailers and chefs, etc. So I'm not sure if I answered all of your questions.
Well,
there,
I can't wait to hold one in my hand, Dan. That sounds great.
Yeah, well, it's kind of fun when you flash the light and you get the reading and you're like, hey, that was an idea. Now it's a real thing. So it's yeah, it's
It lights up.
Progress.
Where do I send my $350?
You go to bionutrient.org and you look on the page for Bionutrient meter, and you can order one.
Great.
It's actually 377 technically. We try to
You misled me.
Well, Dan, I think you've earned the privilege of asking the next question. What do you want to know?
Well, a combination of what I want to know and what I think attendees should know. I think what Didi's been working on is very important. I think the water cycle story that she's been helping, you know, Walter Jena get out there, the implications of that understanding for global cooling in short order, you know, I think is extremely important. So, you know, if she can do a quick overview of what that is, I just think it's a story that needs to be told more well. And then I'm also very interested in what she's been, you know, popularizing, coordinating, supporting in Andhra Pradesh in India, as far as a model for, you know, is it hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people, you know, self-organizing, coordinating across a relatively large area and shifting the climate and building soil systemically in collaboration. It's an amazing story. So I'd love to hear updates, and I'd love other people to be aware of these things.
Great. Let's see. I think I can share share a few slides around the soil sponge and its implication for the water cycle. That we could do that, and the implications for that on public health as well. So let me
The water cycle and global warming, I think, is the key piece that just people don't understand how rapidly we can turn this thing around.
Yeah. So what I would invite, I always like to teach in a way that involves people, because you all actually know way more than you think you know about, for example, cooling and the soils, what I call the soil sponge. So I invite you to think, first of all, of being out in a hot city and taking off your shoes and socks and standing on some pavement, dark pavement.
Ouch.
See how long you can stand there. And then look around and see if you can find a park with some, maybe there's just some bare soil in it, and jump from the pavement onto the bare soil and notice if there's maybe a little bit of a change. And then see if maybe there's a little muddy patch where some kids have been playing with water, or it's a low area and some water has collected there. Stand on that. And then, oh, there's some grass growing. So walk over to the grass and notice how your feet are feeling. And then see that there's a patch of trees and bushes nearby, and stand near them, but still in the sun. See if there's maybe a little cool breeze coming through there. And then walk under the shade of the trees, and right in the middle and deep into a beautiful lush forest with plenty of undergrowth. And keep walking until you go away to upstate or wherever it is near you that's really rural, and out of the city. And notice how much cooler it is. So you already know about the cooling potential of healthy soil, of water in the soil, of plants, and diverse, lush green growth. But I'll give you a little bit of science behind that, that there is well, a lot of what Elaine is teaching about is about how to take those little sand, silt, and clay particles and how biology can stick those together and create something that is an aggregated soil, which basically means that goes from being compacted to having pore spaces in there. And Walter Jena and Walter's a soil scientist from Australia, and we teach together quite a bit. We call that the soil sponge or the soil carbon sponge. And let's see, I'm gonna just share this. And so this is an up close and personal picture. You can see those sand, silt, and clay particles. You can see those biological threads and slimes holding things both up together and also holding them apart. And you can imagine that larger biology has moved through there, everything from roots to earthworms, and created even more tunnels. And that is aggregated soil, and that is, in a larger way, it's the soil sponge. And how I often teach this is to think about a plate of flour and think about raining on a plate of flour and what happens when those particles, those sand, silt, and clay particles, are unaggregated. And you get runoff, you get erosion, nothing soaking in. You have flooding downstream, and you have drought as soon as the water's gone. So you actually have drought and flooding in the same landscape. No water's getting down into those plant roots. So you actually have a setup for wildfire because there's more plant diseases and pests. Also, the dead wood that falls onto the ground doesn't decompose because there's less life in the soil to decompose the plant matter. So that's the lack of a soil sponge. That's a degraded soil, which we have all over the planet. Now, what happens if you add biology to flour? How do you make bread? You add some biology. Not quite the same as soil, but the effect when you rain on those aggregated particles that have pores and that have that incredible structural integrity, like a sponge. So a sponge, if you put it in the sink, it doesn't just need to have pores, it also needs to not fall apart when it's wet. So here on an aggregated sponge-like soil or on bread compared to flour, you can add at least like 9 times as much water. And the deeper it goes, the more water you can add, the more rain that can fall without having a flood, the more rain that can be held in the soil to prevent drought, to help feed the biology, to help give the plants what they need. So this is
and look at that clean water
look
coming
at
out
that
of the bottom.
water coming out. So now
amazing.
suddenly you also have this great filtration system, both kind of a filtration just structurally, but also biologically. It's helping to break down anything back into its original components that can be then used again by the whole system. So so that's basically the same thing that we would see if you do a rainfall simulator, where you see that the more soil health principles are used, that's like not tilling the soil, that's having diversity, that's having living plants in the ground as much of the year as possible, that's leaving plant litter on the surface, all of that. You'll see as you move from right to left, same soil type, same ratio of sand, silt, and clay, but those jars in the bottom go from capturing nothing to capturing all of the water. And those jars in the front go from huge runoff, huge erosion, which also would be blowing away in the wind if the wind blew, to having no erosion, no runoff. So what does this have to do with global cooling, as Dan was asking? Well, all that water at the plant root zone, I'll stop sharing for a moment here. All that water that's at the plant root zone, when it's held in the sponge, when photosynthesis is happening, the plant is also transpiring, very much like us sweating as our metabolism's going. And it's transpiring partly to keep itself cool, partly to process, do something with all that water that it takes up for photosynthesis. And as water changes from its liquid form to a vapor, it actually changes, it takes heat that would be sensible heat that we would be able to feel and measure, and turns it into something, it's transformed into latent heat, which we can't feel or measure in the same way. So so that is cooling, and that's what happens when we sweat, and that's what happens when a plant transpires. But it's not just cooling for the plant leaf, it is actually cooling the air around the plants. And when I was in India in 2019, we went from under a tent on a 100-degree day to, so we were in the shade, to standing out in a field where our heads were in the sun, but we were surrounded by like 5-foot-high plants. And it was cooler in the sun standing among the crop than being in the shade in a place where there were no plants growing.
Because that phase shift from liquid water to water vapor takes energy. It's basically that evapotranspiration process is sucking heat out of the air where we are experiencing, right?
Exactly. And it's the same thing. It's the same reason that, a wet shirt is cooler than a dry shirt, or sweating makes you cooler than not sweating, or why if you pour water on a hot iron pan, as it evaporates, the pan cools, right? So that's all that same principle. But what we don't think about usually is that it's also cooling the air around us, because that heat is latent until it recondenses. Now it recondenses over and over again as it moves up in the air, but it's primarily recondensing up where it's starting to form clouds. So you're also getting more cloud cover over a diverse, lush green landscape. And that is providing that shade, that albedo, that's also cooling, right? And then when you have that cloud cover, you have that cool, low pressure zone underneath, that helps to suck the moisture and the weather systems from one place to another and draw in clouds from other places. So for example, you have a coast here, and then you have mountains that coastal moisture has to get over. If the Central Valley of California had all cover crops and lots of agroforestry, that's all of that moist air would come up over, and you wouldn't be having so much of a drought. But now you have a big heat bubble in the Central Valley that's pushing up and keeping that moisture from coming there. So when you have that cool, low, moist, green, lush, transpiring landscape, they say rain brings more rain, because you have that. So you have that healthy soil. You have the plants are able to keep putting exudates in, keep building the sponge. That plants then can transpire. The rain that does fall soaks in. It's a low pressure zone. It brings more clouds, brings more rain. So there are many places, and there are many examples where we can see that they've cut a forest and the rain goes away, or if someone has reforested with a diverse land, diverse trees and plants, and the rain comes back. So the last point is that what we know about forests, National Geographic just did this whole thing about trees and shade, and they didn't mention transpiration in the whole thing. But so we know that they're cooling in numerous ways, not just shade. But we also, Walter Yena's work, when he worked on cloud formation as a young research scientist for the Australian government, they were noticing that the best way to get water to condense into something heavy enough to fall as a raindrop was using these microbes that live in the stomata of leaves in diverse forests. So the sky has a microbiome, and that microbiome is populated by plants that help, and as plants transpire, all those microbes go up and actually make clouds and make rain. So those are just a few of the many ways that our biological workforce is really an essential workforce, that when we try to kill everything off, or cut everything down, or extract as much value as we can from a landscape, we are kicking ourselves in the pants, because we're ruining all of the systems that we depend on for human health, for environmental health, and for the health of the whole. Okay, I'll stop there. Maybe we'll get back to underproduced later.
This is so fascinating. So Didi, what you're describing is, bringing up for me from the Soil Summit in Zach Weiss's talk. He pointed out that a common notion in many indigenous cultures is that the trees bring the rain. And so what you're pointing out to there is the scientific ecological knowledge that is it's congruent with this ancestral indigenous knowledge. And we've had some questions actually populating into my sheet here. One of them is, what do you think about the ancestral knowledge of indigenous peoples about raising soil and water to mitigate climate change? And it sounds like we addressed the scientific side of that, but do you have any additional component that you want to throw in there?
I mean, the reason that I try to, when I'm teaching in the land and leadership development community, there's very little information that I'm giving. Like, that's unusual for me to give a lecture in that way. I really try to engage people with their own powers of observation, because as I was saying when we started, you already know all of this. You just haven't put it together or stopped to think as a whole. You know all of the little pieces of it because you've experienced it, right? Mm-hmm. So that is the essence, I think, from what I see and what I hear from Indigenous friends, is that it's a cult, tends to be not it, because it's multiple, but Indigenous cultures tend to really value the power of deep observation and deep personal and interpersonal and systems learning, whereas more Western European systems of knowledge and science tend to try to break everything into parts and look at them under a microscope. I'm sorry, Elaine, that's nothing wrong with microscopes. They're both valuable systems.
If you put things back together.
If you put it back together, exactly. So
And
that's what's missing is looking at from both ends. And we have now this beautiful moment in history where we have both. We have sort of the telescope, we have the microscope, we have incredible indigenous science from all around the world, and the internet and international conferences in which we can share things, we can travel and learn. So are we going to use that to extract more value from things, or are we going to use it to actually grow the capacity of the whole system, and starting with our own development?
Let's take choice B, please.
Well, and I would say that one commonality that you three share is that you've each had your own personal moment of taking a step back and having a deep observation, like, whoa, here is like how we can be. And I'm wondering if you could, I'd be curious to hear each of you, like, what was that moment when you stopped and took in more information than your immediate job was asking of you to come up, and what did you notice? Does that bring anything up for any of you?
yeah,
I'm sure we all, each one of us have that experience hiding out. When did it actually gel in your mind that there was a process that you were following that nobody had ever really put together before, where the plant puts out the exudates to produce the enzymes from the bacteria and fungi that would pull the nutrients out of the sandstone, clay, rocks, and pebbles, as well as organic matter. And then when the bacteria and fungi got eaten, now the form that the plant needed right there at the root system surface was now present, and all these other consequences. And you start putting all that together. It took a while. It took,
yeah.
Gosh.
Where were you, Elaine, for one of those moments?
Here in Oregon, after I'd moved from Georgia here, and trying to understand what was going on in all of the different types of ecosystems. Oregon is great for having all of the ecosystem types except for tropical. I was forced to go to Hawaii. It's terrible, but I did it. And putting all that information together and saying there's the emergent properties is what we would call it in science and ecology, that you start getting more than 2 or 3 or 4 different kinds of organisms together, and there are emergent properties that you could never predict if you didn't have all of those organisms together functioning. And so we really need to find out how that functions, so we can be talking at every level of structure within natural systems.
Thank you.
Yeah, so aha moments. You wake up in the middle of the night and you go, Eureka! No, it kind of snuck up on me more. Putting it together, the hard work of what does this mean? What does that result in? Oh my gosh, it's the same. There is the same pattern in all these wildly different ecosystems with wildly different ratios of fungi to bacteria to protozoa to nematodes to microarthropods. And how does that affect the different kinds of soils? How does sand, silt, and clay really work into this? And from a microbial point of view, they don't care. They don't, yeah, they're always going to be able to function someplace. You've got microorganisms that deal just fine with sand or silt or clay. So it is interesting what we get taught in soil science is actually really not that important when it comes to understanding how nutrients cycle.
I can go next, I guess, if Didi doesn't
Yeah.
want to go next.
That'd be great.
I would second Elaine's comment about it being a process that sneaks up on you. in my life. It was certainly, you know, I made decisions, you know, that allowed me to not need to have a job to pay bills, but to be free to follow what inspired me. And I think there was a number of years there where I was living somewhere different every 3 months at the max. It was definitely just moving, learning, finding something new, going there, trying it all out. I think in my experience, I was literally in an ashram in the Himalayas when I was graced with the experience of super consciousness, which is a state of perception that I think we are all wired for. We all have the capacity to experience, and I think it's, you know, it's levels of that the indigenous cultures or traditions are guiding us to. We can certainly externalize our science through instruments like the little shiny object that we're building, or we can internalize our perception to the, I would say, the profound scientific instrument, which is our form, not just the physical body, but I think we've got other aspects, other energetic aspects of our being. So yeah, I think it's certainly a process, but listening to that voice, you know, following your passion, and hopefully at some point turning within for guidance, I think is really important. I just, on the topic of indigenousness, I've been hosting a conference for the past 6 months now or so. Every week we do a different seminar, and we've been bringing up this topic of what does it mean to be colonized? What does it mean to be indigenous? And I think, you know, one of the central points is that we are all wired with the capacity to be either colonized or indigenous. And while you may be native to a certain point on the planet in the past few thousand years genetically, we all have this capacity to tune into our deeper relationship of knowing, and to engage land in a very meaningful manner. So yeah, I think we're all called to that relationship with life, with nature, with God, call it what you will. And if we head the other direction, we'll natural selection will take care of us, right? I mean, it's not very complicated. You either work with nature or you're dead.
Right.
And we're pretty far off the broadly, culturally, environmentally, we're heading down the other trajectory. And I think a lot of people feel significant concern about that. And I think, I mean, Didi's point, I don't know if it's got through to people, but this concept, as I understand it, you know, when the heat comes from the land and goes up and is converted into a cloud that then shades the land, and the heat goes out above the cloud into space, you can rapidly facilitate global cooling. But it only happens when life is flourishing on the land. And so it's incumbent on us to do as much as possible to regreen as many places as possible.
No bare soil.
Thank you, Dan. Yeah. I personally was very influenced by reading Braiding Sweetgrass and learning about a lot more about, holy cow, there's a totally different way of understanding the world and receiving information about the world. And there's a long history of knowledge out there. And my initial response, because I'm human and insecure, was, oh my gosh, I'm not qualified to be as, like, to care about the world as much as these other people who've had longer time than I. And so I can both honor the ancient amount of time it has taken for such deep observations to have emerged in the existing indigenous communities that are amongst us today, while also I give myself permission to wholeheartedly love the world. And I am so grateful to have found a place working in this culture with the Soil Food Web School, where I can help people do something that can scientifically regenerate soil while also energetically just feels loving. It feels like a caring thing to do. And that inherently makes me feel more whole than I've ever felt in a position in my life. And so that is a whole other component of healthy humans, the mental health component, that I am so grateful to have found finally, having come from the academic background. So thank you to all of you for doing the work you're doing.
Thank you very
All
much.
right. So let's see, I'll jump in. And I'll get back to the statistics about the cooling. We'll circle back around to that.
Yeah.
But I'd say 3 or 4 little vignettes of those moments for me. One was, I was probably 8 or 9 years old, and very troubling times, family members having been murdered, and it's sort of very chaotic times in the world. And my father had bought a little, very falling down farmhouse in New Hampshire with no running water. And there was an old logging road through the woods. And for some reason, I was allowed to go off by myself, which kids aren't usually these days. And I went down this logging road and found a little swamp, and there was a little mossy, ferny hummock in the middle of it. So I went through the water and climbed in under the ferns, laying on the moss on my back, and just listened and looked, and the sunlight was coming through the green, and I just felt like, this is me. And even now, if I have to think about sort of who am I always go back to that image of being very much just in the whole system. And then another moment for me came when I went to an event that was highlighting both alternative energy and sustainability and alternative medicine. And I thought, what is that crossover? That, like, why those two things? And so I thought about it all night long and wrote up this manifesto of ecological medicine or sustainable medicine, of thinking about what does it mean for human health? What is the relationship between human health and environmental health? Which now seems like a sort of a simple question, but at that point it was not. That nobody was talking about sustainability and healthcare. And that became the beginning, that piece of paper, that manifesto became the beginning of the 9-year project of writing The Ecology of Care. But as I was writing it, then Hurricane Irene hit Vermont. And we had all that flooding, and I had been thinking that climate change was sort of something happening elsewhere. And then, yeah, it would be nice to be a little warmer in Vermont.
Surprise.
So it definitely became personal, and it was a very, very vivid imagery that really stayed with me of water hitting soil and what happens, and the incredible difference between places where there were plants and where there were no plants, what happened with the flood. So that got me really interested in climate change and public health. And then when I understood how grazing management and soil health impacted climate, my first intro was kind of through the carbon cycle, through Judy Schwartz's book, How to Save the Planet, looking at soil carbon. But then starting to look through the lens of water, which, going back to my original thing, I'm very much of a water and earth person. So water and soil together was just amazing to me. And that's sort of where I've landed and stayed. So the statistic, now we'll get back to the detail. Walter Jena, the scientist I was talking about in Australia, calculated that approximately, and this is hypothetically, right, if you're just looking at this one aspect, that a 5% increase in transpiring green plants on land worldwide would offset the global warming that we've already seen. Just through the issue of latent heat flux, not through cooling, not through shade, not through any of the other things, just through latent heat flux. Then there's all kinds of other things you can add in. And John Norman, who's a professor emeritus of biophysics, he wrote the textbook on environmental biophysics. I said, everybody's questioning this number. Can you look at it? So he ran the numbers on, a paper napkin and said, yep, this is about right. But humans don't necessarily have agency over all land. So, because there's mountaintops and this and that. And so he just looked at on agricultural land, and he calculated that about a 25% increase in green cover, green transpiring plants would offset the global warming we've already seen. So can we have 25% more plant cover when you look at all the bare soils? Absolutely, we can. All that bare fallow, even in California, the places where they've taken land out of production and then they just like plow it and leave it there. Can we put that into pasture? Can we even just put anything green will do it, right? It doesn't matter what species it is. Invasive will do it happily for you. In fact, I think
get it started.
What some of those big bushy invasives are doing.
Get it started on the process of succession and let it go. It will do it all by itself. We don't have to be out there manipulating it. Just let those organisms do what they're supposed to do.
And then meanwhile, we're not just working on cooling through the water cycle. Then we are also cooling through the carbon cycle, right? Longer term. So the carbon is getting into the plants. It's getting down in the root exits. It's getting more stable in the soil. So, but while we're waiting to regulate the carbon cycle, we can cool immediately through the water cycle. That's the real key message here.
Yeah, brings into question all of those conversations about soil carbon credits. And I also want to echo Dr. Shiva's notion about carbon credits to all of the regenerative folks, that the carbon credit industry can be a tricky thing because it could be selling off your good, healthy root carbon and soil microcarbon to those black, dirty pollution and just allow the polluters to keep on polluting, is what she said. And
don't really get fooled by that net carbon. There's all this language right now about net carbon, and that is not the same thing as carbon. Net carbon meaning like trading.
Exactly. Yep, totally.
And either way, it's 2050 that we're talking about, or is being talked about as a timeline, at which point, things are going to be in a much different situation. Why? I mean, Didi, you've been at the center of this. Why? How can this story get told more broadly? If our objective is actually to modulate the climate towards a more balanced function, it seems like this understanding is profoundly important.
To make everyone's Zoom background look just like Dan's background right now, right?
I'm across from a very lovely lake that's cooling over there.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
I'm down in my hometown, Boston area, where I grew up.
Totally covered, no bare soil, garden. Hard to see when it's, we're up in the 99 temperature.
Well, actually, so we had a question come in. I don't want to derail this current conversation, but this notion's important. Someone's asking, how can we grow healthy food in cities where there is no patch of healthy soil anymore?
You build that.
Sense? Yeah. Does this make sense to grow vegetables in boxes for which we have to import soil? And what do you think about vegetables grown in optimized and healthy, highly controlled medium, which is just a solution developed to bring all the nutrients needed? What do y'all think about that?
Yeah, the last one pains me, where they're going to be adding insoluble inorganic forms of nutrients, and whatever isn't taken up by the plants just flushes out and ends up in the rivers and lakes and streams and causing problems. We can't be doing that. We have to, if we're going to bring plant production inside, we have to have soil, not dirt, soil with all of the organisms in it, where we have all of those benefits that we're talking about that natural soil food webs will bring about. So the plant's healthy, the humans eating that, the animals eating it, and it is entirely possible to grow in hydroponic systems with normal nutrient cycling in and around that root system on the above ground part. So we have to insist that people get as natural as possible, even if they're growing in greenhouse situations.
I'd say, part of the why we're developing this understanding about relative nutrient value is because a lot of what's out there is relatively empty. And, to Elaine's point, if you don't have the microbes as part of the ecosystem of the plant, it's functionally impossible to get that plant to produce high level of nutrients. It's just, it's the microbes that they've evolved that symbiotic relationship with to get the nutrients in it. So, it's not efficient. Microbes are much more efficient than fertilizer. We can outcompete the chemical companies if we focus on nutrition, and people understand those implications. Broadly, however, I'm of the opinion that we are animals who belong in nature, and we should not be envisioning a future where we're all living in cities. I think, agency, land access, systemic, if not land reform, some way to get humans, which are animals, back on the land is foundational for any number of other cultural dynamics. We've got plenty of state parks and national lands, before we talk about getting rid of property, that are, ripe for healing. And we've got, a new CCC wouldn't be very difficult to get people out there building, all the trees are going up in smoke because the land hasn't been managed because there's no people there. And the people knew how to manage that land. And so we belong on the land. We don't belong in cities, as far as I'm concerned. I get in trouble for saying that, but I believe it so strongly. I don't think working for money, to be in debt, to be, tuning into energies that are dissonant is our highest purpose. And I think as long as we don't consider that the environment we're in is part of the problem and take whatever steps we can collectively, probably as well as individually, to begin making that shift. I think we have to just take it to that level. I'll stop.
And I want to just speak to, there's this very romantic notion that cities are dirty and that the countryside is clean. And, a farmer friend in Illinois, regularly when I'm talking to her, there's planes going over spraying this and that, and not just on the land, but in the air that everyone's breathing. And I don't know that that's better, or worse than the pollutants that we have in the city. Likewise, the soil in cities, yes, there are some toxins that accumulate in cities, some pretty serious ones. And also people use Roundup, et cetera, on their lawns. But agricultural soils can be horrendously poor as well. And so I just want to put in plug for that all soils need to be reconsidered and cared for. And we need to collaborate with the microbial workforce and with plants to regrow healthy soils, a healthy soil sponge everywhere. I don't see anything wrong with importing, moving some soil to one place or another, as long as Elaine says, as long as you know how to grow more. Now, there's a tremendous amount of food waste in cities. And if you can have a proper composting operation that knows what they're doing, there's no end of, we're not running out of sand, silt, and clay. Okay, it's not going anywhere. So, and there's so much actual green space in many cities, and there's so much flat space on rooftops in places that tend not to have green space. And there's so much pavement that needs to be broken up so that rain can soak in. There are some depaving movements out there, like in Somerville and other places, that will help to reduce flooding if we can get rid of some of that pavement that's unnecessary. So, I think getting food fresh, diverse, getting people involved in producing their own food is tremendous in terms of getting kids interested in trying different things. That's what they do at our local elementary school, is they thresh wheat, and they, and they sell strawberry pies, and they did, it's all in there, and they're interested in tasting things because they grew it. Mm-hmm. So I think it's all important, and I think many people will continue to live in cities. I love the image of Detroit when Detroit was kind of collapsing and everybody was moving out, and suddenly there were sheep running through the streets, and all these, houses, people were taking over the lawns of abandoned houses and growing food there. And
oh goodness,
the post-apocalyptic organic gardening movement. I think
totally.
That's kind of where we're heading. So,
well, and all of this is bringing up for me personally, trying to also turn my front lawn into just food, and being a mentor for the Soil Food Web School. I'm making compost, and I'm trying to get trees and plant trees and establish more green space. But it also takes money. One, it took money to be able to purchase this land where I'm now able to have agency over planting the trees in it. It takes money to, do a lot of these processes, not only for that, but also all of the education that has gotten me to this point to know that I need to get green there. So how do we break down that economic barrier and make it equally possible for all humans to access healthy food, healthy plants, healthy soil, and have health themselves? What comes up for you?
Well, I think a natural way to fund all of this is if you've got land of any kind, or let's say in cities, for example, there are all the empty lots out there. Can we convince the city to help get rid of the concrete or the tarmac off of those places and go in with, a civilian conservation corps, as Dan suggested? We've done that before. Let's do it again, where people are given jobs to, in the cities, remove that concrete tarmac. Let's put in the vegetables. Let's put in the plant material. Let's make certain that we have those fungal species and bacterial species that will decompose the toxins or sequester those nasty compounds in certain places so that they can be very easily removed from that land. We don't want to have to bulldoze out all of the, it's dirt in those places and transport it to a waste management process. Now we've got 2 contaminated places instead of just 1. Let's clean up the things in place, and then we can start growing food for human beings. And then that means we don't have food deserts anymore, because people will be growing their own according to the principles where those plants express their genetic potential, because they're not stressed by a lack of nutrients or bad diseases or pests or problem organisms taking them out. So we can, what does that do to the way water vapor is moving, the heat sinks, the cooling areas, as we take every single empty lot present in this urban area, suburban area, and start growing food for the local inhabitants?
I think a key piece of all of this, I'm going to keep it quick, is I think seed saving is a really key skill for people to learn. It's really fun. I live near one of the great seed savers, Sylvia Davitz, who teaches still. And I also, one of the projects that happened near me was people planting berry and fruit bushes and trees throughout the city to provide, it's not all your nutritional needs at all, but I think there's a lot that can happen in urban areas, in underserved areas, changing some of the policies. Are you allowed to keep chickens and other small livestock in urban areas? And then the good old thing of sharing, right? If I grow great tomatoes and you grow, and you make eggs, in your backyard. Maybe I can't do everything in my tiny little yard, but I can do one part, you can do another, and we can swap. So there's some incredible amounts of food being grown on small lots with the people who have figured out urban farming, or even just small scale farming. So what you can grow if you're just growing corn or soy in terms of what you can provide is so different than when you have a kind of a multi-story system that's in healthy soil.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of how many people you can provide for. Yeah, you could make like a lot of bottles of Coca-Cola, with all that corn, or you could actually have for real food for hundreds of thousands of people. So one of them is going to make you sick and the other is going to keep you healthy. Take it away, Dan.
Yeah, I just wouldn't mind if you would reframe the question again, Adrienne. It was about money and how do we do without it? How do we manipulate it? Or
how do we make sure that money is not a factor inhibiting people from health that comes from plants and soil? Because I know that there are inequities out there, and you can throw money at the problem and spend a lot of time in nature and buy a lot of high-end food at the organic fancy grocery store, but at the end of the day, there's also education involved and access to land and being able to have the time to be able to spend time in nature and not be working 9 to 5. There's all these limiting factors in terms of equity with getting people healthy. What do you think?
The question was really about food access, quality food access for everyone who don't necessarily have the resources to be shopping at Whole Foods. Okay, I thought that's what it was. One thing we found I found as a farmer is that when you work in harmony with life, your cost of production goes down. And we've learned from our lab work that when you're working in harmony with life, the nutrient values go up. So I was just doing a report today. We were looking at, I think it was wheat and zinc levels in wheat, and it was something like 260 to 1. Like this grain of wheat had 260 times as much iron or zinc as this one. And all the elements were at least three times, 4 times, 5 times more in one over another. So when we're talking about cost and quantity, I think as my experience as a farmer is that your cost of production goes down when you work in harmony with life. So you actually don't need to charge as much. That's one point. Another point is, and it's not research that we've done, but some allies of ours have done, is to look at, blueberries on the shelf at Whole Foods and at Walmart or kale or whatever it is. Lo and behold, what's nutrient levels in the crops on the shelf in Walmart in many cases are higher than nutrient levels on the shelf at Whole Foods. And in general, they're both relatively quite low, but it does not necessarily connect between the label and the marketing and the price to nutritional value. So, there's lots to talk about there, but I've been thinking about this thing since we've had COVID, and, a lot of, as I understand it, a lot of children in various parts of the country are getting something like 80+% of their calories from the local school system. And the food pantries and things like that. And I think, if we have the ability to say, this grade D beef is, for many intents and purposes, bad for you, and this nutrient dense beef is good for you, can we organize around food quality and have this be a topic that people can say, it's important for us that the food that's being fed to our children, that's coming through our, WIC or whatever other programs is nutritious in nature. I think a lot of there's some deep systemic things there. And, one thing has to be, how do you organize a movement? Because we can philosophize all day long about what we'd like to see happen and what a good idea may be, but the logistics of getting from the cultural dynamic we're at now and going from there to where we want to be, it's going to take some practical steps by some group of people.
Right. And it sounds like one of the steps you're starting to take. I popped up this graph here for you of the different crops that you looked at here on the vertical axis, and the amount of calcium in those crops, and the variability and the wide ranging possibility for a single kale plant to have, the amount of calcium is wide ranging. Do you want to speak to that for a moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think I brought it up broadly earlier in my introduction, but what we've done at this point is we've looked at 21 different crops across the board, from grocery stores to farmers markets to off the farm. We've tracked from the farmers we've worked with. Now this has been both in the US and across Europe. We've got 3 labs, one in California, one in Michigan, and one in France. And last year we had about 150 farms that did fairly detailed management data, recording. So did I do cover crops? If so, when did I plant them? How many were in it? How many were in the mix? How tall were they? Did I till? Did I use fertilizer? What kind of seed did I use? What's the soil type? Did I use any inoculants? Did I do irrigation? Did I do foliar sprays? Whatever the environmental conditions management practices were, and then they sent their crops and the soil they grew in into the lab, and we could correlate the connections between environmental conditions and management practice, soil dynamics, and nutrient levels in the plants. And there's been a few things we found. One is that variation is massive, and it's across the board. There's some local, backyard gardener who you'd think maybe has high quality produce that shows up quite low. Who knows what they're doing or how they're managing their soil. There's some, stuff that's off the shelf that we would consider to be, conventional, that is showing up nutritionally very high. And what we understand is it's not about the label or the identity, it's about the management and the environmental conditions that those crops were grown in. And we understand pretty categorically that, as I said before, it's only when the microbes are functioning well that those nutrients get into the plant, and that does not necessarily correlate to a label or a regional identity or anything like that. But yeah, I mean, across the board, this is just calcium on these crops in 2020. We've been doing it for 3 years. You can see the variations are massive. If you look at, say spinach there, the bottom of spinach is probably 15, milligrams per 100 grams of fresh weight. And the top is probably, 130? Call that 8 to 1, right? I mean, if you Swiss chard, the bottom is probably, again, 15, and the top is 220. So that's a 12 or 14 to 1 variation. Literally, it doesn't matter which element or compound you look at. In fact, with the compounds, it's more like 50 or 200 to 1. But the variation in nutrient levels is massive. Chronic degenerative illness, in a lot of cases, correlates directly to insufficiency of these nutrients. So our thought is we use money to inspire the shift, that if people are buying, choosing this bag of carrots as opposed to that bag of carrots, then the people, based on nutrition, which correlates to soil, we apply an economic driver to incentivize whoever's growing your food to focus on nutrition as opposed to volume, which will, by its very nature, incentivize those biological systems to be, deepened. So yeah, for me, it's been a question of not, do we have the answers? Do we know what we can do or how we can do it? I mean, what needs to be done? The question is, how do we pull it off? How do you leverage visceral self-interest, which seems to drive most people, and build a dynamic where solutions are, aligned with money. I think money is a tool. It's been abused and misused from that colonized perspective, but we can also work with it from an indigenous perspective to support the solutions we want. There just has to be a framework around it that is strategically developed.
Well, so challenging question for you, just to play devil's advocate. Does that mean that once we get these tools out there widely available, does that mean that the most nutrient rich kale or broccoli is going to be the most expensive on the shelf?
Well, if it's 18 times more nutritious, and it only costs 50% more, you could argue you're getting a total deal. I don't think it's going to cost 18 times. I mean, there will probably be some fancy rich billionaires that are going to be paying stupid money for fancy things, but that's not the ambient dynamic. My experience as a farmer is literally your cost of production goes down as your biological activity goes up.
Yep.
Right? And your pest pressure decreases, your disease pressure decreases, the need for fertilizer of any sort, it drops off the, it disappears. So, your plants are healthier. They, each one realizes more of its inherent genetic potential. I don't know. I don't think we, if you think all carrots are exactly the same nutritionally, then maybe you can make some arguments, but because they're so varied, I don't think that argument or that concern, and it may take a little while for everything to settle out and move and shift, but
and it's going to depend a little bit on whether those nutrients that are extremely high, like in the kale, when you're on the extremely high end, are those going to be digested properly by human beings? Is that too high a dose of calcium? And so some percentage of the calcium just flushes right through because your body can only take up so much at one time.
I mean, what we understand is that the levels and ratios of these elements and compounds rise together. So the only way to build the antioxidants and the polyphenols and the terpenoids and the alkaloids is to have balanced levels of all the other things. A lot of times you'll eat something and you'll feel like it's empty. You're empty. When to use Didi's, strategy, have you ever bit into a carrot from, I'll say, Cal Organic that left you wanting to spit it out?
Yeah.
Have you ever bit into a carrot from the garden that left you wanting to, rapidly finish the whole thing? We're animals, and we are tuned with, somebody was telling me this recently, there's more of our genetic code dedicated to the function of our nose and our tongue than any other system. For some reason, nature thinks it's really important that we're able to taste and smell well. And that is because those nutrients that correlate with health correlate with flavor and aroma for us, right? It's how we've evolved to be. Sorry if the wind noise is a little bit loud.
That just makes the pandemic even more devastating if that's what it takes away from us to start, beyond all of the other things. But so I want to circle back here and provide just a brief notion about where this is coming. So how do we get bionutrient rich plants? We're talking about healthy plants, healthy humans. Let's talk a little bit about the mechanism here. And I love this figure from this paper that I cite down here that just shows the way that plants can bring in the microbes, exactly the right microbes who have the enzymes to do the decomposition work, to be able to extract all of the micro and macronutrients out of all of the sand, silt, clays, rock, pebbles that the plant could ever need, and in the right ratios that the plant needs, because these organisms are building their own cell membranes and signal pathways and everything that they could possibly need. So as those microbes, which are here the little Pac-Man figures and the little, I believe, or maybe those are the enzymes and these are the microbes. I don't know what that is in this, but it's beautiful. So the plant can call in exactly the right microorganism to get, it needs slightly more boron or a little bit more magnesium or slightly more calcium. And kind of what you were saying, Dan, that the plant's able to balance out their nutrient ratios that prevents those pest outbreaks, because when a plant is just dosed with NPK, I saw someone in the comments had said that NPK are only 3 letters of the alphabet, and we're missing so much of that periodic table alphabet, right? So I love that. And the reality is that all minerals contain the entire alphabet if we have the right microbes who have the enzymatic potential to do that hard mining work, which they're not going to spend their time doing that unless they have plants to feed them, to drip feed them those exudates and support that community of enzyme producing microbes. And then, of course, we have to have the predators to come along who will then take those microbes who have incorporated all of these macronutrients into their bodies. The predators come along, squish out all the juicy stuff and then try not to become toxic internally, because if you hyper accumulate any of those nutrients, it's going to become toxic to that organism. So they will poop or pee it right at the root surface because that's where the plant has drawn them into. So I just love this model of thinking about health because it's all in the very mineral material that we walk upon. And if we have the access to the biological, then we can access that into the plants in a balanced way. And then when we're eating those plants, I imagine we also have a whole different layer of microorganisms that are doing the work of enzymatic breakdown and selecting for our own bodies what it is that we need. But this is where my knowledge is actually limited in the human side of the microbiology. So I'm going to back up a few slides that I put in here to this one. And I'm curious, so what this is, brief primer for all of you. This is a review on healthy soils for healthy plants for healthy humans. And this shows the digestive system and the different facets and different environments that exist, along with some features about the microbiota of those digestive system components, as well as the root system. Those root tips all have these different zones. The outside, as you go internal, you get different environments as well. So I'd be curious to hear if anything comes up for you about the relationship of soil microbes to gut microbes. What do you think, Didi?
So yeah, a few things come to mind here. One is I love, I had sort of was getting close to this, but I hadn't quite gotten there until Ann B. Clay showed a slide at I think it was actually a Bionutrient Food Association conference, and said that basically the human intestine is a plant turned inside out, or vice versa. Like they're like one of them, the microbes are on the outside of it, and the other one they're on the inside, but basically they're very similar in the way that they work. And then I've been talking for a while about that the soil is like this mucosal membrane for the function of the land as a whole. So that it's this very microbially rich mucoses, slimy
a layer, a habitable layer,
a layer,
right?
where reproduction and respiration and digestion, all these things happen. Other people talk about it as the skin of the land, but of course our skin is another aspect of our microbiome. So and as we just learned that the air has a microbiome around the trees and up into the clouds, and we have a microbiome in the air around us. So the idea that it's just in our gut is rapidly becoming an old idea, even though that was a new idea just 10 or 20 years ago. So and another way that I like to teach is to start thinking about layers of intelligence. And the most basic aspect of intelligence in a living system is the membrane. So even just like a cellular membrane of knowing what do I need as a living system, as a cell, as a plant, as a microbe, as a human, and what is toxic to me? How much do I need? When do I need it? What is it? What do I need in combination with what else? And I think the thing about our smell and taste is so key. And Fred Provenza's work, if people aren't familiar with it, is amazing along those lines. He has a big book called Nourishment, and if it's too big and thick of a book, there's a book about his work called The Dorito Effect by a different author, that both get into this world of taste and smell as part of our own basically membranous intelligence. And if we're intelligent in our taste and smell, imagine how much my dog, the difference. So when you have other animals have even more of their system dedicated to that. So
right, intelligence as sensing the environment in all of the chemically mediated information that is contained in the food and otherwise.
Yeah, and I mean, even if you, I mean, in a membrane, that's happening very literally, right? With the biochemistry from inside to outside. What's me and what's not me?
Mm-hmm.
What is that boundary? And how much of not me can I let in and still be me? But of course, that holds true emotionally, right? Or spiritually, or in any, or culturally. Like what is a meaningful exchange and what is colonization, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think we all need to be thinking on many levels about membranes.
Mm-hmm.
And back into the soil, Walter Jena, who I've mentioned a few times, talks about the mycorrhizal fungi being like this huge membranous extension of the plant's root system. That is, a cubic meter of healthy soil can have up to 25,000 kilometers of fungal hyphae, all of which are extending that plant intelligence to go and find what it needs and make those decisions, because it's a according to Walter, it is a more sophisticated system of choice making, that fungal hyphae, than the plant root, which he likens to being a bit more like a straw that's taking up the NPK just unmediated, not in a particular ratio. I think it's more complex than that, but I think as a basic metaphor, I think there's some real truth to that.
That's beautiful.
I'll just add on. I think Didi's point about it's not just the soil and the gut. As I understand it, what 90+% of the cells in our body are not human. Every single one of our organs, is managed by, and our immune system, microbes everywhere. As I understand evolutionary biology, microbes came first and they evolved us. And, the plants make sugar to feed them so they can, inhabit soils more well. And we've got a little reproduction mechanism. They built a walking reproduction mechanism to disseminate them across the ecosystem. So, the James White's work about the microbes within the plant, and how the plant is actually farming microbes, quote unquote. It's taking them in, taking some nutrients off of them, feeding them, kicking them back out, bringing them back in. It's they're everywhere, and in everything, and it's the foundation of life. And it's interesting to see how the cultural construct is coming forward. People are like, oh, there's a connection between there are microbes in the soil, and B, there's a connection between them and me. There's just so much more awareness and knowledge that I think still hasn't reached the broad masses yet. But it's part of why I was so I couldn't believe the response to COVID being, pretend that you can hide from viruses. Do you know what viruses are? Do you know how we've been, they have helped evolve us? They facilitate our, we critically need them. They're, I don't know. It's just, we need to deepen our understanding of our relationship with life and those who came first, and our symbiosis with them. I think that many things can be solved by that. But it's great that these things are at least beginning to come forward.
We have only begun to understand what's going on in the soil. We have just barely scratched the surface. There are going to be so many more discoveries oncoming through, the next 10, 50 years. So, if you want an exciting new career, come learn about soil biology.
Yeah. What do they say? We've named 5% of them or something, or 2%? What is it?
Yeah, it's around 2%. And the thing is, we keep discovering more all the time.
And miles deep, right? When they were digging to see how deep they could dig, they found microbes 5 miles deep or something. in the crust.
The deepest I know about is 12 miles.
Oh, 12 miles. Sorry. I guess
12
that
miles is the deepest. And you find living active bacteria, fungi, and some protozoa at that
Yeah.
depth. So, they kind of laugh at us human beings when we say, roots only go down 3 inches. Yeah, no, roots go deeper, and then the microorganisms go way deeper. What are they doing down there? What is the role and the function? So we've got a lot to learn. Our arrogance and imagining that we understand everything is just rather disgusting.
We'll talk about a deep observation, right? Like literally, but then also in deep evolutionary time, think about how much time bacteria and fungi have had to accumulate knowledge about being alive, being organisms, and then now we're just starting to pay attention. It's just wild. So there's some.
I would say that there's one thing I would say about understanding is it's a fool's errand. Like, how much do we actually logically need to understand? Or can we take the model of other cultures and understand that the important things are shown to us? We have this instrument of discernment called a body, or we call it a body. I think it's more than that. And what we're called to do or what we're pushed away from, what gives us fulfillment and what gives us pain is our internal guidance mechanism showing us what we're here for. I don't know that we need to spend so much time in our minds logically proving stuff. It seems to me we need to spend more of our time in our beings engaging with life. And anyway,
I think it's really dangerous to engage with life without knowing exactly what's going on. It's been one of those things that humans have done up to now where they just assume that things are working like this. And we don't really know. I don't think that we have to have every single human being on the planet involved in these learning, but we need somebody looking and to make certain that we as human beings don't mess it up again. We don't know how something's supposed to work. We are really good at messing it up. So let's stop having that paradigm.
I think indigenous cultures globally had done brilliant jobs managing the landscape with no Western scientific frameworks. Either look here in the Americas, look in Australia, look all over the world. We've got models of humans really profoundly engaging with nature in very meaningful ways without any PhDs or peer-reviewed papers. I don't know. I mean, I think it's great to know, and it's great to verify or have explanations for, but as far as where priority resides, I think it's I'm actively building a little meter and doing science. So
right. So there's the direction and the intentions, and then the what is the very next step, right?
Yeah.
And it sounds like in some ways it is using a microscope and looking to see who's there, because we have developed these frameworks of knowledge to understand what that means about these systems of health. In some cases, it's building a spectrophotometer to go out and look at the rate, nutrient quantity. Didi, what would you say is the very next step for us?
I was just thinking that it's funny because with mechanical systems, we often do require training, licensure, etc. Right? If you're gonna, work in a factory, if you're gonna drive a car, etc. But with
or even a microscope or a spectrophotometer, that's all mechanical systems. Yeah, totally.
But I mean, we assume that people need some training or they're gonna break it, right? Or they're gonna cause an accident. However, we don't require that for people to tinker with natural systems, living systems, even children, right? I mean, there's no license to become a parent. I'm not saying we should have a license, but I'm saying it's very intriguing that we have such a different standard when one of them is a system that we're only very recently dependent on mechanical systems, but we've always been dependent on living systems. So
it's like familiarity breeds contempt.
Yeah.
But we don't really have to understand that because it happens every time I eat this, you know.
Right. Novelty breeds respect. Yeah. Yeah. There is this whole idea that everything new is good. And if it's old, if you said, do you want something new or something old? You'd always say, well, I want something new, right? Do you want the new model or the old model? But of course, really the old is. So get back to your question. That was just a follow-up to before. The next step, well, I'll just say what I'm doing right now as the next step is working on building a community of people that is interested in living systems and developing ourselves as living systems, a community of practice as a living system, and using those two levels of development to be able to think about the living systems that we're affecting or trying to affect. Mm-hmm. So that when we think about a living system, we have all of each other's perspective, and that we're looking at them through trusted frameworks from various wisdom traditions to be able to not, to look and understand with the understanding that we're never going to fully understand it, but that as a community, we can hold ourselves and each other to higher and higher levels of integrity as we make choices. So that was very abstract. If we had another 2 hours, I'd lead you through some examples that would give you an idea of that. But
well, I was curious, is this something that is exemplified in your work in India as well?
So India is an example of that. And I did bring my work there. They're using my work as a way to help develop curriculum. When you say India, what we're talking about is there's a project in Andhra Pradesh, the Andhra Pradesh Community Managed Natural Farming Initiative, which comes out of the zero budget natural farming movement. But Andhra Pradesh took that, and there are groups of women self-help economic groups that have been meeting for over 20 years to do micro lending with each other. And to build a very, very solid communities of practice in villages in India. Millions of women are involved in this. And those women took on natural farming as a project in the state of Andhra Pradesh. So there are now over 800,000 farmers in Andhra Pradesh who are experimenting with using no inputs other than things that are made from natural materials, no seeds from outside of the village, nothing that needs to be sort of bought or brought in on any sort of a corporate level. So in switching from pesticides to like herbal preparations and agroecological principles for plants that are trap plants and plants that are
push-pull sorts of
all of that kind of thing. Yeah, predators and etc. So those are communities of practice that are supporting a much bigger system change that I think their goal is within less than 10 years to have the entire state of Andhra Pradesh be a natural farming state. And it's a big state in southern India, southeastern India. And there are other countries that are looking at that as a way, other states in India and also other countries that are very, very interested in studying that. So I've been brought in along with Walter Jena on my end to help train the trainers and develop curriculum in living systems. And Walter's been brought in to help look at the science of what's going on and help them unpack that. And what they've done with some of the work that came out of our conferences here in the States is they started experimenting with pre-monsoon dry sowing of planting crops before the rains come, understanding that there's water available in the atmosphere that the plants can harvest and water available in the soil that like the mycorrhiza can access even when the plants can't. And they're getting unbelievable crops and 365-day green cover in areas that would have been considered desert. So
Wow.
super exciting.
That's
So,
huge.
so
And
yes,
the
so
weather
that's,
is
so that
changed.
is, what's that?
And the weather has changed, right? The level, the average rainfall patterns are changing because of it.
Yeah, I mean, they are tracking, we don't have that data. You know, we know that like locally, yes, you can measure that here is cooler than there, that they're just starting to track that data. But one thing we do know is that some of the illnesses, there's incredible public health data from some of the hill tribes that are using this in Andhra Pradesh, where their health markers have changed dramatically. So that's, and I keep saying, make sure you get the health data and make sure you're collecting rainfall data and make sure you're taking temperature, taking each other's temperature and the temperature of the air. But so we don't have a lot of data back yet, but for sure they're able to grow longer and, you know, more intensively because they're able to, you know, the rain is soaking into the ground. That's the big thing. Like when the rain falls, where does it go?
That's
so
huge.
Yeah. So the Land and Leadership Initiative is right now mostly online, and we are basically creating this community that is an ongoing community, developmental community of people who want to keep learning living systems thinking, basically. So
and for folks who want to learn more about living systems thinking or start something similar, where would you direct them? How would they start that?
So landandleadership.org, you can find the free curriculum that's there, the Understanding Soil Health and Watershed Function. You can see past webinars with Elaine and Walter and other folks. You can find a bunch of fact sheets and articles that outline some of the science Dan had brought up around cooling, etc. And we are working on, we haven't worked out all the details yet, but we're working on offering the 5-day introductory course on soil health and watershed function and living systems through the Soil Food Web School as well. So keep your eye open for that there as well. So, but you would see it at either website, be able to find it. So
that's perfect. I just pulled it up in the background.
If you sign up for the mailing list, people, you know, you'll get notification through the Land and Leadership Initiative.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is really fun.
Okay, Elaine, my question is now coming to you. What is the best thing that we could do as our very next step? We being the people here, but also, you know, our friends and family. What's the very next step that we all can take?
Get out there and find out what the organisms are in your, well, let's hope it's soil. You know, the difference between soil and dirt is not really very well understood because our soil scientists, many of them use those terms interchangeably, more or less. Dirt is just the mineral components, the sand, the silt, the clay, rocks, pebbles, parent material. It's just that, you know, no life involved is all you have basically in dirt. Or if there is any organisms, it's the not so wonderful pathogens and pests of the bacterial community is what you would have mostly in dirt. Whereas in soil, you've got to have all this nutrient cycling going on. So plants would be able to survive without the application of pesticides or inorganic fertilizers or things that take care of parasites and things like that. So dirt versus soil, go out and take a look at what you're actually trying to grow things in. You know, when people talk about going out into the forest or going out to some place and taking your shoes and socks off and getting your feet into the soil, it better be soil or it's going to be compacted, and that's not a very fun thing to try to push your feet into. It's not going to satisfy spirit as much as you would want. So let's make certain that people are trying to grow plants in the proper balance of fungi to bacteria within that soil, all the different things that the biology can do for you. Come join us, because we're just now starting to document the microarthropods and macroarthropods and add that into the soil food web model of how soil works. Microarthropods and macroarthropods do some very interesting things, and we need to have that put into the food web. Well, how about spiders? Well, how about all these other things that are slightly larger? They're not really microorganisms. How do you define a microorganism? It takes a microscope in order to see it. That's a microorganism, the simple explanation. So how about macroorganisms that you can see using a dissecting scope, or you can actually, with a loop, you can look at those organisms and add them into your food web and figure out what they're doing to nutrient cycling. We've only yet begun.
So it sounds like you're putting out a call for everyone to make a Tulgren funnel and extract all of the microarthropods, all the arthropods and critters that could come out of their soil and or compost, and tell us what you're finding, because then
we'd like them to go ahead and get a microscope so they can look at the bacteria and the fungi and the protozoa and the nematodes, and then we can add on microarthropods and macroarthropods, because you can't have the micro and macroarthropods if you don't have the bacteria and fungi in the system. If there's nothing for the things that eat the bacteria and fungi, and of course those predators are eaten by the larger predators, and the larger predators eat the next large microarthropod, eat the microarthropods, they eat it's a nice food web. Everything eats everything else, basically, but we need to document it so we understand whether that's a good thing or a bad thing for the growth of the plant that you want to grow.
And then how do people go out and grow more soil, grow more organisms to create healthy soil? What should they do?
You've got to go out there and get some waste material. All those dead above ground parts of your plant, the dead leaves in the fall, all of those food resources that you want to put onto the surface of your soil. Once you have a good, healthy food web in there, you just have to put those organisms or those organic materials on the soil surface. When you're first starting off, for the first couple years, maybe you're going to be making compost. So maintaining conditions in that decomposition process, in that composting pile, you want to maintain the conditions that grow just the beneficial microorganisms. So you're adding the organisms back into your soil. But how do you know what you need to be adding back? Microscope. How do you know if they're surviving once you add those into the soil? Microscope. So it's like every time you're really trying to do anything with soil, you want to use your microscope to make certain that you're moving along in the right way.
And if folks want to learn how to use their microscope, where can they go, Elaine?
The Soil Food Web School. So soilfoodweb.com. Please spend some time looking over our information. We have a lot of case studies where, I've been doing case studies with people since I basically started working at the University of Georgia. Was the first case study that we ever really did at the Horseshoe Bend Agro ecosystem on just off campus. And from that point on, working with growers all over the world, I like to say that I've managed to make it to all of the different continents except for one. Working with people, showing them how to do this process. Those people who can't listen to instructions and they can't follow, just forget it. But those who make that effort to get the beneficials up and growing, you can do it in your own compost. you add that compost to your soil. And so what's missing in your soil, make sure we've got extras of those organisms that your plants need, of the balance of the fungi and bacteria. Make sure you get that right.
Thank you. And to those, I noticed there was a couple comments. For those of you who say that using the microscope is not quite as easy as it sounds, one of the beautiful gifts that Elaine has provided us with throughout her life's work is by developing a method that makes it possible. Because it is, if you just put something under the microscope, it's like, well, there's a lot here, but figuring out a quantitative, a methodical way to figure out, do we have what we need here? That is a way that I've really enjoyed learning about the soil. So before we fully wrap up, we have about 9 minutes. And since we've talked about what's missing in the soil, I want to ask what's missing here in our conversation. Elaine, Didi, Dan, is there something that's missing in talking about, or even what's missing in the global conversation? However you want to take that. What is missing?
Did Dan get to say what his next steps were?
Oh, Dan, yes, thank you. That's what's missing.
What's missing?
I appreciate it, Didi. Thank you. Dan, please tell us, what is the best thing that we all could do now?
Thank you, Didi. I think your comment about intelligence and cell walls or boundaries, Didi, is a wonderful way of framing what's just popped into my mind. There's all kinds of conversation that we have about the way the world is, the way people are, what's wrong, et cetera. I feel like the only thing that we have control over is ourselves. And as far as I'm concerned, use that metaphor that Didi was, or not metaphor, that literal explanation of the form of intelligence being the boundary and determining what comes in and what doesn't come in. I talk a lot about food as nutrition, nutrient density, say choose this carrot over that carrot. But thinking about the energy that comes into us and the energy that we put out, I think, having those same kinds of boundaries for the kinds of conversations you have, the things you engage with electronically, movies, social media, advertising, I think if we hold ourselves to some basic level of, a standard, each of us, and, understands that we're propagating out this vibratory field of either coherence or dissonance. I think the food piece is a very important piece, but I also think our thoughts and our ability to have to make decisions about those things all day, every day. So I would say the best thing for us to go forward and do is to take responsibility for ourselves. There was Yogananda was the one who got me into the science of the East, and one of his lines that I like to pops up over and over again is save yourself and you've done your part to save the world. Getting on a big trip about other people and fighting this and fighting that and things like that, I think is really, to a large degree, disassociating yourself and giving your power away. I think as you do become stronger in yourself and do have those boundaries, then you're shown what it is that you're here to do, and you're guided from within. So I'm not sure if that's an appropriate answer for the venue.
It is an appropriate answer because it is your answer, Dan. I appreciate that.
Vibration is the way that nature communicates, from what I can tell. I mean, the antenna on the insect are literally antenna, and they're tuning into the vibration of the leaf. And as I understand it, it's, if that leaf has lots of amino acids in it, but not complete proteins, it has the vibration of food for my larvae. And if it has complete, proteins in it, it has the vibration of static, like literally
like a little flashing neon lights saying food here, mom.
Lay eggs here, lay eggs here. Exactly. I mean, as I understand it, it is, vibration on these various different levels is how nature communicates, and this whole words thing is so entirely insufficient. But
Well, Dan,
at least we
you're
can,
right on point. The chemical ecology, the molecule that those plant volatiles that they're putting out, those scents of the flower, the scent of the leaf that's getting chewed on by the
Right.
aphid is attracting the parasitoid wasp to come and lay their eggs in that aphid. That scent molecule, there are, receptors for certain ones, but there's also a theory that is the vibrational theory of scent, which is that the, vibration of that molecule, the resonance of that is what creates the scent. There's some really
Or-
cool TED
and
Talks about
or that some of the insects, if the male insect is emitting his pheromones in the atmosphere, and the female insect can smell him 2 miles away, or the other way around, she's emitting a pheromone, he can smell her, and their noses are not well developed in an insect. How is it? How many pheromones must that female insect be emitting for a male insect 2 miles away to smell her? I think this was Phil Callahan's work out of the University of Florida, showing that it's the vibration of the molecule, which is what the antenna is tuned to. It's like a radio station. You drive out of coverage and it starts to get staticky. You're like, oh, looks like the radio station's that direction. So
that.
as I understand it, yeah, this chemistry model that we've been trained with, is true to some degree, but it's also physics. In physics, everything that's a thing in chemistry is a vibration.
And then add enzymes on top of that.
Which are
and the physical chemical world just really doesn't understand enzymes and what they do out in the real world. So yeah, we've got a ways to go to get it right.
Yeah. Anyway.
Man, well, I feel like I could launch now into another hour of talking about physics and time and heat and exergonic reactions and how we experience the world. And I would look forward to having many more conversations with each of you in time to come. So any final words from anyone?
This has been fun. I'm always learning stuff, and I appreciate the expertise that you've shared here. So thank you, Didi, and thank you very much, Dan. It's been fun. And thank you, Adrian, for hosting all of this. You're amazing.
It's always a pleasure. Wonderful.
Yeah, I'd be very happy to I think we should pick up where we left off, because I think that's actually this idea, what I would call what we were just talking about is what paradigm are we viewing the living systems through? And I would love to have a conversation about how we get to choose, just like as a membrane, we get to choose how we're looking at the world, and that how we view it is going to impact not only how we experience it, but how we treat it. And I think that's where it's all about. And then of course, all of that comes back around to us, how we experience it, because how we treat it is going to change how it treats us, because it's all one system. So I think that's a really key conversation to be having right now. So I'm glad we were getting there, and I would welcome a second round next month. So it's great to be with all of you.
Likewise.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. And that's a wrap. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate you engaging in conversation about health.
Thank you very much.